How's everyone? Woo. Okay, so we're going to take 1 second and we're going to get up and stretch. All right. So as Jorge mentioned, I have a podcast that's called How She Did It, and I interview women of color and I explore their career paths. So I am also a Uber podcast listener, and I also like memes, which will make sense as we progress through my presentation. So I'm going to be talking about how to develop and promote your podcast. And so unintentionally, I think I have a evolution and storyline that I wanted to share with you to explain how I got into deciding to do a podcast. And I think it's a good exercise to think about because I find the podcasts that I really enjoy, it's very evident that they love what they're talking about. So think about the things that you really love and the strengths that you have if you decide to come to, when you're in my breakout session, start thinking about what am I good at? What do I really love talking about? And how does that fit in with your brand and how to use this podcast to be able to promote yourself and your business. And don't be ashamed if your thing is pop culture, because some of my favorite podcasts are about pop culture. So here's a little bit about my backstory. 2003, I was working for a small engineering firm. I was doing HR, recruited a lot of people, interviewed thousands of people. And that made sense for me. This whole thing, it wasn't like, these things are making sense as they're happening. But when I thought about what I wanted to do, I was like, oh yeah, this is coming together. Like all of the things in my past made sense. So I'm interviewing a lot of people. I work for an engineering firm. So it was a lot of very technical people, not a lot of women that I'm interviewing that are coming through the doors, that are applying, not a lot of women getting hired, not a lot of women in the company. And so that kind of bothered me. And that just became something that was always something that I recognized. This is really cool. It's kind of more women here than men. I'm excited about that. So in 2011, the company I was working for was acquired by a large public company. And I lasted about 6 months, and I was like, I do not like how the company is changing and wanted to change. Later in 2011, I got a new job. It was cool, but it was very boring. I went from a company of 90 employees to being 3 people. And I had an office that didn't have a window. It was a converted supply closet with a too big desk in it. So it was totally not my jam, and I was very unhappy. And so I was looking for ways to occupy my time during the day, and I discovered podcasts. So I subscribed to my very first podcast, which is Girl on Guy by Aisha Tyler. She's an actor, a comedian, director, and I was excited because not only was she in the podcast game, but she looked like me, she was black like me, so I was excited about that. And then 3 years later, I discovered another podcast. And in those 3 years, I subscribed to and listened to hundreds of different podcasts. I'm very fickle. If I get bored, then I will unsubscribe for your podcast, but I'll try out anything. And 3 years later, I discovered another podcast by 2 black girls called Another Round, which is excellent. And then at this point, I'm realizing wow, the podcast world is very male, very white. There are not a lot of women of color who are doing podcasts, even as guests, not much less hosts. So it's something that I was starting to be aware of. And I was like, I want to do something about it. Now I'm thinking about my HR background in recruiting and what do I want to do? So I was thinking about I want to do some kind of interview series. So I registered a domain in October of 2015. 4 months later, hanging out with a friend, and I'm like, I'm kind of thinking about doing some kind of interview series. Let me interview you. We're at lunch in a crowded restaurant. Pull out my smartphone. So number one, you don't need expensive equipment to get started. And I interviewed her, I asked her a couple of questions, and at the end of it, she was like, oh, this was fun. You asked some really good questions. And I was like, this was fun, so maybe I'll do something with it. That was January 2016. My podcast didn't get released until September of 2017. So that's a year and a half, really 2 years from the time that the idea came to when I actually got stuff done and made it happen. So I do not want you to be like me. It should not take you 2 years to do a podcast. Go to the next slide. So, talking about memes, here's a meme about me. This is Yolanda. Yolanda has a podcast. It took her almost 2 years to release her very first episode. Yolanda wants you to publish your podcast in less than 3 months. Don't be like Yolanda. When I released my podcast, I was hanging out with some friends for a day. We were doing a mastermind together, and I was talking about my podcast and like how to better promote it and what I should be doing. And one of my friends at the mastermind said, if you have a podcast, people are automatically going to think you are the shit. So take advantage of that. Because we all are in awe. Like whenever you see someone that's actually doing something, you just automatically assume that they know what they're talking about. And so then it leads to opportunities. It leads you to another way to promote yourself. So I'm really excited about being here and talking about podcasts, and if it is something that you are considering doing, and if you're afraid of doing it, because let me tell you, having to listen to your voice on audio is the worst, but you have to get over it. I had to get over it. I had one of my guests, I interviewed her, and it took her 2 months to listen to the episode because she doesn't like listening to her voice. And so you learn how to lean into things that you may be uncomfortable with. I grew up in a time and just been more, I think that's what makes me a good interviewer. I like getting people to talk about themselves so that I don't have to talk about mine. But that's where people really connect your audience to your podcast, when you share stuff about yourself. When you share something with, if you decide to have guests on your podcast, that's where the magic happens, because then you're connecting with that person, and then as an extension to your audience, and then your audience gets really excited about what you're talking about. So lean into that. If you are afraid to do something because you have to listen to your voice, or you don't think you're capable, you don't think you're technical enough to press record on something and record, I'm not saying that those things are valid, but and that's what I love about this conference is about getting stuff done. And you aren't going to wake up one day and be ready. You only get ready by doing and messing up and trying again. I remember I spent so much time preparing for my first interview, and I did it off-site, and we were meeting together, and I forgot the cable for my microphone. So no matter how much you plan, you're always going to forget something, but you'll never learn how to develop your systems and your workflow to eliminate those issues until you start doing something. So, advantages to podcasting. Who here already knows what they want to do for a podcast? But most people are kind of like, is anyone thinking about doing or really want to do one, but you don't know what you want to talk about? Okay, well, we're going to talk about that in we're going to do a lot of brainstorming, time brainstorming so that you are forced to respond in a certain amount of time. But for me, and for a lot of people, podcasting is a way not necessarily to promote, it's indirect promoting. So you are getting people to come to your website, and because when people see that you have a podcast, they're going to be like, well, who is this person? They're going to be curious. So have a website where people can go to and learn about you, and then if you have something to offer them, whether it's a service or a product, then it's there for them to, because they're going to explore around your website. Then it also increases brand visibility. I call it OPP, like other people's property. So the good thing, not the old school song. Because you'll find as you promote and publish your podcast to different platforms like iTunes and Stitcher and TuneIn and all these different places, it juices up your brand presence online. So if someone Googles your name, like if someone Googles my name now, all of the different podcasting platforms are what comes up on the first page, because they have these huge directories of podcasts, so you're getting their Google juice by being in their directories, and so it's another way for people to find you. And then it just diversifies what you're doing. You may be doing blog posts, you may be doing a YouTube series, but this is just another way for people to get to know you. And I think podcasting is like very flexible because you can experiment. You can try something one episode and it may just not go well. And then in your next episode, you just don't do it. So it gives you the flexibility. But then it also, a lot of times when someone may discover you, because you may interview someone and then they share it and then someone discovers you, they have an easy way of going through your entire library versus having to go through your website and find all your episodes. If they subscribe to your channel, then they see everything that you've done and they can go at their own pace, which leads to the next thing. People can passively consume your podcast. I listen to podcasts when I'm exercising, when I'm commuting, when I'm working, if I'm doing something that doesn't require my brain energy. So people can listen and get to know you and not necessarily have to be at their computer in order to listen to you. So it's cool, and then it can be a very inexpensive marketing option. The only expenses that I have with my podcast is I spend $20 a month with the software that I use to edit my podcast. I spend $15 a month with the host that I use to host my audio files, and then I have a website, and I pay for it on the year, but it's kind of like $10 a month. So for less than $600 a year, you can have a podcast, promote it, and bring on a lot of different people to your website and to learn more about you. So it's an inexpensive way. So let's talk about podcast categories. So these are the categories that I see that exist, so you can start thinking about it. So there's kind of like what I consider a monologue. And that's like one person who is talking to the audience. And here's an example of one. It's called Side Hustle School, and it's a guy who tells stories about people who have side hustles. And so it's a daily podcast, so it's insane. But he keeps his episodes under 10 minutes. And so that may be something that you're considering. I call this second category question and answer, also known as advice. A popular one that has been around for a long time is by Dan Savage. It's called Savage Lovecast. And what he does is he has people who call his hotline and ask him questions, and then he answers them. Sometimes he brings on a guest to help him answer a question, but it's Q&A. And it's been around for a long time. And then there's storytelling podcasts. Like probably the grandfather of this is This American Life. And one of my, probably my top podcasts is called Reply All. And they are very produced. So this is where it can get expensive unless you know how to produce and edit things, because they have music and they have people talking, but it's storytelling. They're just telling stories. So they should talk to you if this is something that they want to do. And then the final one is Conversations, which I consider mine a conversation podcast, because I bring on a guest, I ask them questions, and then they answer them. And then these are two of, sometimes you may just have a one-on-one conversation, sometimes panels. So it's multiple people that are all participating in a conversation. But these are the 4 types of podcasts, the categories that exist. And these podcasts use multiple ways to capitalize on their podcast. Some of them sell ads and sponsorship. If you listen to podcasts, you'll hear like the beginning, middle, and end advertisings where, probably Blue Apron, MailChimp, or kind of the popular ones, Casper, we all want those things. And they were like on every podcast. For that, you have to have like a certain number of listeners before those companies are interested in advertising on your podcast, because they want to know that a lot of people are going to hear it. So then that's something that you'll probably have to build up to. then you can advertise your products and services. Maybe you're talking to someone about something, and then you have a product that would go perfectly for this, then it'll be a perfect time for you to advertise your product or service, or advertise someone else's product or service and maybe get an affiliate commission off of it. Promote your conference and events. If Rebecca had a podcast, she'd get up and promoting the conference to her audience to get them interested in coming. You could sell premium memberships to your community. So that's one of the things that Savage Lovecast and Reply All do, is they have premium memberships. And for that, it may be like advance notice for events. It could be like ad-free versions of the episode. You could get merchandise. You can get access to a community of all members that gets access to the host. So that's something that you could also consider doing. And then you can get speaking and performance gigs. Like I'm speaking here because I have a podcast. One of my favorite podcasts is called The Unofficial Expert. It's two comedians whose job is to make their guests feel really bad about themselves. And it's in a good way. No, well, probably to the guests. It's a really, really funny podcast. But they get a lot of comedy gigs out of that because it's just like a really, really fun podcast. And then recruit talent. People want to be a part of things that are successful. And I think Reply All is a part of this Gimlet Media. And because they have probably 15 different podcasts, whenever they're looking for talent to join their team, you see the quality, you hear the quality of their podcast, you want to be a part of this growing company, so they don't have a problem finding great talent for their company to grow because people want to be a part of it. So a few tips about podcasting. This is something, the first one, Commit to 6, is something I heard from Tim Ferriss. He has like an insane podcast. The episodes are like 2 hours long and he releases them multiple times a week. But one of the things that he gets asked a lot is, should I do a podcast? And what he says is commit to 6. That means commit, if you are considering doing it, commit to doing 6 episodes. You may not publish them, but record 6. That gives you a good idea of the work that's involved in having a podcast. It also helps you improve things about yourself, maybe asking questions, listening, not interrupting people when they're talking. That's like my thing that I really had to work on. So that gives you a good enough time to see if it's something that you really want to do. But it also gives you the opportunity to see what you would want to change because you've done enough of them. So if you're considering or you're maybe on the fence, just commit to 6, and then you can decide it's not for you or you can keep going. Another thing is keep your initial expenses low, especially, I don't even care if you know this is definitely what you want to do. Just start off with basic equipment. If you have a smartphone, you have a great microphone in your hands. If you have a computer, you have a great recording device and microphone as well. So don't feel that you need to go out and buy like really expensive microphones and headsets and recording equipment. Don't do that. Start low and then build up and improve and upgrade your equipment as you move along. Friendly fire. This is like the best advice that I was given, was interview your friends and people that you know first, because that gives you time to practice on the process on people that'll be more forgiving. Because if you get like a really legitimate person and you don't have your stuff together, it could just not be a good situation. So practice with your friends. They're more forgiving, and it makes it just less stressful for you in the process. Then edit the episodes yourself. Editing is the worst part of the process. And it's the worst and best. It's the worst because it's really hard. It's the best because if you ever get to the point where you outsource it, you don't want the person who is doing the editing for you to hate editing your podcast. So then as you listen and have to edit yourself, then that helps you to become a better podcaster, because then you maybe realize that your questions can be better, or you learn how to ask better questions to get the right answers, and then the person who's doing it for you doesn't have to do as much editing. So I would highly recommend to edit them yourself so that you can really hear how you can improve and then become a better podcaster in the process. Then be adventurous. There's no set way that your podcast can do. Some of the ones that I really like have very unique ways of leading their podcast. So don't feel that you have to subscribe to the way that This American Life does storytelling podcasts. You can do whatever you want. There's no rules. Try out things. Try something out one episode. If it doesn't work, it's okay. Try something else. And then also, as you're trying to figure out your format, take stuff from a bunch of different people. Like mine, I can tell you, like, I do this because this podcast does it and I like it. So also, if you are a big podcast listener, it's a great way to kind of come up with with a format that works for you that you're excited about. And then finally, this is another piece of advice that I got from a podcaster, that don't think that there's a magic bullet that's going to skyrocket the listenership of your podcast. No marketing tactic works for everyone. For me, I'm about to start experimenting on LinkedIn because I'm a career-focused podcast. And I think I'll probably get more traction there. That may not work for you. Something like Instagram may work for your topic. So just be willing to try different avenues. Look at the results. And by results, I say like the number of likes you get, the number of comments you get, the number of shares you get. If you realize that you're not getting any traction on the platform, stop using it. But just be willing to experiment. So a little preview of our breakout session is, these are the things that we're going to do. So we're going to dissect your favorite podcast to come up with ideas for the structure of your podcast. If you don't listen to any podcasts, one of your takeaways that I'm going to give you, I'll show you how to find all kinds of podcasts and take a listen to them and see what you like. So the first thing I want you to be able to answer is, how can I stand out as a podcaster? So by looking at what's out there and your ideas, you can figure out how you can stand out as a podcaster. Number two, we're going to brainstorm ideas that you have for a podcast that relates to your business. And so I want you to leave with, like, what will my podcast be about? And then number three, pick 12 topics or guests for your show. So this is when you will write down the names if you decide that it's going to be, you're interviewing someone, like, who are 12 people that I can probably ask? And remember, we said commit to 6. So I'm saying 12, so you can ask 12. If you get 12 people, then great, but more than likely you'll get 50% of them to say yes. And you realize, like, as you start asking people, like, people will be like, yeah. So the goal is to have 12 guests or topics to talk about, and so that you can commit to doing 6 of them. And then pick a release date. Remember, you don't want 2 years like me, so your release date can be 3 months from now at the latest if you're interested in doing a podcast. So we'll help you figure out what your deadline is and what needs to happen from now until then to make that possible. Once I committed to it, I committed to doing it at the beginning of August, and I released my podcast in September. So it's possible. And then this is one of my favorite quotes from one of the best TV shows ever. Something I want you to remember as you're doing a podcast, and thinking that you're often inspired by yourself.